May 7, 1945, a temporary processing camp outside Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Spring mud carried the sharp scent of tank tracks and spent gunpowder. She stood there at 23, in a faded auxiliary uniform far too large, her hands shaking as American MPs pointed her toward the medical tent. What happened over the next 17 minutes stayed with the soldiers for years. Not because of something terrible they witnessed, but because of something small they chose to do. Sometimes humanity reveals itself not in grand acts, but in quiet moments. As the Third Reich crumbled into smoke and memory, young American soldiers would prove something Nazi propaganda insisted was impossible, that an enemy could choose mercy over humiliation, kindness over conquest, and dignity over revenge. This is a story about the instant when rigid ideology collided with simple human decency. A moment when the machinery of total war paused long enough for someone to see another person, not a symbol or a uniform, not a flag, not an enemy, just someone's daughter, frightened and exhausted. The war in Europe was ending, but it was ending slowly. In early May 1945, the German army wasn't retreating anymore. It was unraveling, units scattered, officers disappeared into the countryside. Soldiers drifted west toward American lines rather than east toward the Soviets. Everyone understood what the Eastern Front meant by that point in the war. Stories had circulated in whispers for weeks, from Königsberg, from Berlin, from shattered towns along the road west. What the Red Army did to German civilians rarely appeared in official reports, but every woman had heard enough to fear it. By 1945, more than 500,000 women served in German military auxiliary roles. They worked as switchboard operators, radio clerks, radar assistants, and searchlight crews. Some even supported anti-aircraft batteries defending cities from bombing. They wore grey uniforms and functioned inside the military system, yet their status was uncertain. They weren't technically soldiers. The Geneva Convention didn't clearly define how they should be treated if captured. Were they civilians? Combatants? Something uncomfortably between the two? In reality, the answer depended entirely on who captured them, where they were taken, and what mood victory arrived with. On May 7th, one day before Germany's surrender became official, General George Patton's Third Army processed thousands of prisoners across Bavaria and western Czechoslovakia. The numbers were staggering. At the Pilsen intake station alone, military police recorded nearly 5,000 prisoners every 24 hours. The stream seemed endless. Hitler Youth boys still wearing shorts, old Volkssturm men, and officers claiming to be simple clerks. There were pilots without planes, soldiers without units, and women in unfamiliar grey uniforms. The women always complicated things. Their fear was different, sharper, quieter. Sergeant James Whittaker, a 26-year-old MP from Iowa, had worked intake for 3 exhausting days. He had watched hardened officers cry and teenage boys cling to each other in silence. But the women carried another kind of fear. You could see it in the way they stood close together, always watching the guards. Many expected the Americans to behave exactly the way their own propaganda had warned them. Whittaker later wrote that the expression in their eyes was unmistakable. They looked at us the way people look at a storm coming, he remembered. After years of brutal war, many expected cruelty. Some of the soldiers wondered if they deserved kindness at all. Still, when you looked closer, the anger faded. Beneath the oversized uniforms were frightened young people who had grown up in a collapsing world. Most were barely older than the Americans guarding them. Among them was a woman later recorded as Margareta S. She arrived on May 7th with 43 others from a German communications detachment near Karlsbad. They had walked west for 2 days, sleeping in barns and drinking from icy streams. Their decision had been simple and desperate. Better the Americans than the Russians. That calculation carried them mile after mile across muddy roads and shattered villages. Processing prisoners meant medical inspection. Every captive had to be checked for disease, injuries or lice before being transferred to holding camps. For men it was quick and routine. For women the same procedure carried a different weight. Margareta had spent the war working a switchboard, routing military calls through tangled lines while listening to panic in distant voices. She came from Dresden, or what remained of it after the firebombing earlier that year turned entire districts into ash. Her family had fled the city during the chaos. 7 weeks had passed since she last heard from them. The final letter mentioned food shortages and rumors of Soviet tanks moving closer every day. Margareta had joined the auxiliary service for simple reasons: steady meals and a small paycheck. By 1945, ideology meant very little. Survival was the only politics left. When 12 women were ordered toward the medical tent, her stomach tightened. Rumors from the East echoed in her mind. No one had stories about Americans yet, only silence filled with fear. The tent itself was little more than canvas stretched over wooden frames. Sunlight leaked through the cloth walls, casting shadows that anyone outside could easily see. Inside were folding tables, medical crates, and Captain Daniel Chen, a Chinese-American army doctor who had already spent 11 straight hours examining prisoners. The process was efficient, 4 minutes each. Remove outer clothing, brief inspection, check for lice, record any wounds. Professional, impersonal, and fast. But the open flaps of the tent faced the main yard where hundreds of prisoners waited under guard. Privacy barely existed. Silhouettes moved across the canvas whenever someone stepped inside. Margareta understood the medical necessity. Understanding, however, did nothing to calm the fear rising in her chest as the line moved forward and her turn came closer. In the world she grew up in, modesty was tied tightly to honor. Exposure, even accidental, carried deep shame. Standing in that crowded camp with soldiers and prisoners watching, the thought alone made her hands tremble. When her name was called, she stepped forward slowly. The ground felt heavy beneath her boots. The canvas walls glowed with sunlight, turning every movement inside the tent into a shadow visible from outside. Margareta stopped just inside the entrance. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her tunic. Her voice came out small and strained as she whispered, "Please." Not in front of everyone. Captain Chen looked up from his clipboard. He had processed dozens of prisoners that morning. Most faces had blurred together after hours of repetition. But something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was fear wrapped tightly in discipline, the kind of fear someone tries desperately to hide but cannot. For a moment he simply looked around the tent. Outside stood American guards, prisoners waiting in line, silhouettes visible through the canvas walls. The system was designed for speed, not comfort. Protocol offered no instructions for this situation. The regulations said nothing about privacy. Time was precious, and thousands still waited to be processed before nightfall. He could have continued exactly as written. Most officers would have. War rarely leaves room for small considerations. But Captain Chen hesitated for a few quiet seconds. In that pause, the machinery of the camp seemed to slow. Then he made a simple decision. He turned toward the American soldiers standing nearby and gave a short order. "Turn around," he said calmly. The guards blinked in confusion but obeyed. One by one they turned their backs toward the entrance of the tent. Chen then walked to the open flap and adjusted it, blocking the line of sight from the yard outside. It took only a moment. No regulation demanded it. No report would record it. It was just a brief gesture, a quiet effort to give dignity where none had been required. For Margareta, that small act felt enormous. The crushing humiliation she feared dissolved in an instant. In a war that had stripped so much humanity away, 4 seconds of empathy changed everything. The examination continued quietly after that. The procedure itself remained the same, clinical, quick, and professional, but the atmosphere inside the tent had changed. For the first time since arriving at the camp, Margareta felt something she had not felt in months. Relief. Not safety exactly, but the sudden realization that humiliation was not inevitable. That even in defeat, even in captivity, a stranger could still choose respect. Within minutes the inspection was finished. Captain Chen marked the paperwork with steady hands, barely acknowledging the significance of what had just happened. Margareta stepped back into the sunlight, clutching her new prisoner documentation card. It listed her identification number and assigned her to the women's detention compound outside Pilsen. According to the records, she would likely remain there 3 to 6 weeks before repatriation. At that moment, the future felt uncertain but survivable. She was released on June 23, 1945. The war in Europe had ended weeks earlier, yet its scars remained across the continent. Margareta eventually returned to Dresden, traveling through broken rail lines and ruined stations. The city she found barely resembled the one she had left behind. Miraculously, her mother and younger sister had survived the destruction. They reunited in a cramped apartment surrounded by rubble and reconstruction. Her father and older brother were never found. Like millions of others across Europe, they simply disappeared into the chaos of the war's final months. Life moved forward slowly. In 1948, Margareta married a factory mechanic rebuilding electrical systems in the recovering city. Together they raised 3 children. She worked as a secretary, lived quietly, and rarely spoke about the war years. Friends later said she carried those memories privately, like fragile glass that might shatter if handled too often. Only once did she share the story openly, with her granddaughter many decades later. She didn't describe battles or politics. She spoke about the American doctor who had turned away. To her, that moment had been proof that even during humanity's darkest conflict, small choices of kindness could still survive.